Welcome to Ask Psych Sessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. This is a two-part series featuring interviews aimed at amplifying the conversation around equity, diversity, and inclusion in the classroom and in higher education. It is meant to be practical, to help everyday teachers like us identify and engage in steps toward inclusive pedagogical practices and systemic changes. No matter where you are in your understanding of equity, diversity, and inclusion, we think you will find these conversations helpful and enlightening. And now, please enjoy EDI Ask Psych Sessions with Marianne Lloyd.
Thanks for joining us today in our continuing conversations around classroom discussions, particularly centered around race and racism. Our next guest is Moin Syed, who's from the University of Minnesota. Thanks for joining us, Moin.
Thanks for having me.
So can you just give our listeners a little context? University of Minnesota, what are you teaching there? Grad, undergrad, how big are your classes? A little bit of that information, and then we'll jump on in.
Sure. So I'm in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota, which is a very research-oriented department and institution. And sometimes there's a mistaken belief that at R1 or research-intensive universities that teaching isn't important. And for all your listeners out there, I'll say right now that is absolutely not the case. That we take teaching very seriously, and me in particular, I really take teaching quite seriously. So our teaching looks a little bit different than at some institutions. So I do teach quite a bit at the graduate level, and so I'll teach small seminars on different topics, usually no more than 10 students, sometimes as few as 5 students. Those courses have included cultural psychology, history and methods of psychology, developmental, and also I taught a course on teaching of psychology. And then I also teach at the undergraduate level. Now, our curriculum varies quite a bit. Some courses are huge, actually our Psych 1001, our intro course is 1,200 students, so that is obviously very large. But we also have some smaller classes. And so largely what I've taught at the undergraduate level are seminars or upper division smaller classes where students can really get into specialized topics specifically related to culture and diversity. And then an important sort of often unacknowledged aspect of teaching that happens quite a bit in our institution is really what we would often call mentoring. So working directly with undergraduate students and graduate students in a research lab context. For anyone who has that kind of experience knows that there's just a ton of teaching that's going on. I mean, it's really what it is, it's teaching. And so spending a lot of intensive time with students trying to develop their ideas and their methodological skills. And I should mention also I'm the director of undergraduate studies for my department. And so I tend to think about not only what I can do as an individual instructor and mentor, but also what I can potentially contribute at a structural level within my department and how we can change things to better serve our students and better serve the discipline.
All right. Now, I don't even know where I want to start. So
I said a lot.
There's so many options, right? So I can see where this fits into all of those spaces. But maybe let's start at that most macro level as the person overseeing undergraduate curriculum. Is your department having conversations around how well you are or aren't doing, dealing with diversity, either both in terms of content or in terms of the students that you're serving and meeting their needs?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have been having these conversations for, I would say, last several years. So I was hired 11 years ago in the department, and it was an open area search for what they called a multicultural psychologist. So they were looking for somebody who did some kind of cultural psychology. So they were looking to diversify their department in terms of research and also teaching offerings. And that was really direly needed at the time and still is. University of Minnesota psychology has historically been very traditional within the field of psychology, which you can read as being very white and very male. And we do not have a diverse faculty at all. And it's been something that we've recognized over time. But I'd say in the last maybe 7 years or so, we've really started to engage in a variety of initiatives to try to diversify our graduate student body in particular. we've been focused on, and then more recently focusing on faculty and undergraduate students. So diversity was one of the core aspects of our 3-year strategic plan that we developed about 1.5 years ago. And so it's very timely now, of course, that everybody's talking about race and diversity, and that really, we are not just beginning the conversations now, we've been having the conversations for a while. But it's important that we're having the conversations because historically we have not done a very good job of representing diversity within the department. So the first step, I think, for any department is recognizing that and not saying, oh, no, we're doing fine. Look, we have this one course. One course really is not enough to deal with the importance of culture and race and related topics. And you really need to think about it from a more structural perspective. And so that's what we're beginning to do. And we've been, again, having those conversations. It's not easy, and it requires people changing the way they think about what they're doing. And also just, the principle of academic freedom is so strong, especially within our department, that it's not our custom to meddle in other people's approaches to teaching. Right. And so if we're suggesting that maybe instructors should think about how to incorporate more diversity related topics, that's sometimes goes against kind of what traditional norms have been. And so that takes an adjustment of the department.
And maybe we'll just sit there for a minute, because as you said that, I sort of agree and hear that, but I would predict that if I taught my research methods class for my experimental master's program, but suddenly wanted to do it all on qualitative methods, that someone would probably pop in and say, "Oh, excuse me, I think we definitely need to talk about some experimental and quantitative methods in there." So, was there a conversation that people maybe realize implicitly there had been some assumptions made about what was appropriate, and it just happened to be that the field had kind of quietly agreed that diversity was an issue for cultural psych? Did you have that sense when you came in, or?
Yeah, well, so I think it's kind of interesting you use that example because I don't know if your course is actually called experimental methods or experimental psych, but a lot of research methods courses at universities, including ours, are called research methods in psychology. It's not called experimental methods in psychology. But then what gets the major focus is experimental methods. So in that, if you're saying this course is about research methods, and then you're only giving a small slice, that's potentially problematic. If your course is clearly about experimental and then someone's saying, okay, you need to incorporate qualitative, well, that makes a lot less sense. So I think we can translate that way of thinking to our substantive courses as well. If the course is called, Introduction to Developmental Psychology, and you're talking about developmental psychology broadly, but then all the research and all the concepts that you're talking about are only focused on in the US context and research based on white, largely middle class samples, which is what a lot of developmental psychology has been, but not all. There is plenty of research going on across the world with a variety of samples, and in the US with ethnic minority samples. But if you're only focusing on sort of that traditional knowledge that has been in the mainstream, but the course is supposedly a large survey of doing developmental psychology, then you're actually not doing the subject justice. If in contrast you called it, developmental psychology of white Americans, then okay, then that's what the course is about, and it's clear. I doubt that anybody would do that, but at least it's making the context clear. So I think the problem with our substantive courses in the way we've taught them is we teach them, the mainstream work that's focused on largely white American samples as the standard or as the default. And so anything else is sort of accommodating some different view where there's no reason for that to be the default, except for the fact that we, live in a racist society and that we tend to enact our racism without even realizing we're doing it.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. I suspect all of us can go and sort of think about whether it was the way we were trained or the way our courses are, and take that lens to it, and and not just make it the add-on too, because sometimes I think you see that it's like the later chapter in the book is like, oh, but wait, here's some potential criticisms about what we've done.
So that's exactly right. There's a saying within sort of cultural psych circles. There's a metaphor of culture is chapter 13. I first learned this as a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz, where I did my PhD. Maureen Callanan, professor there, talked about that, how every time she would open up any edited collection that she ever contributed to. She would look at the table of contents and not see her contribution, flip the next page and see that it was the last chapter or near the last, which was cultural context of development, right? We look at basic processes first and then cultural processes or contextual processes as an add-on. So that's the cultures chapter 13 model. That's the way that the vast majority of psychologists in the US and in many parts of the world are trained. In contrast, I was unique because that program in developmental psych at Santa Cruz really rejected that model and adopted what's called a cultures chapter 1 model, right? That it's foundational, that we take a cultural approach, that we understand all aspects of what we're doing as being cultural. And when I say culture, that subsumes race and ethnicity. That culture is sort of the higher order category. So we always take a cultural perspective as sort of the first view of things. Now, it's important to know that that doesn't mean that we're saying everything is hyper contextual or that cultural relativism or anything like that, right? It's about understanding the potential for any psychological phenomenon to have a cultured nature and being ready to attend to that and understand that knowledge in general is generated in a cultural context and that there has been well-documented limited representation in terms of who has been included in that research. And some of that is because of institutional racism. So it's just about understanding that and bringing that to the fore and sort of thinking, okay, I'm teaching introduction to biological psychology. How do I frame the teaching of this course, and at what level is culture relevant? So it's just bringing that sort of from the front rather than teaching it and then in the final week, if there's time, including, such a session on cultural variations or whatnot.
Which might almost always come from I recently just learned from recording these podcasts, this idea of a deficit model, right? So
right.
that when you do it that way, that sort of, it's like, here was the standard and now here's movements from that standard.
Yeah, that's been discussed for decades, and it still hasn't changed very much. If you look at most cultural work, is usually coming from a deficit perspective, but not all.
So I want to take what you just sort of said and maybe transition in the classroom. If we really take that perspective to what we're teaching, then as psychologists who are studying behavior, primarily human behavior, I shouldn't say primarily. If in the classroom, we primarily have students in there, so that's going to be the most relevant to that. I would think that in terms of creating a classroom sort of a space of belonging, that really sets the stage that, all of the students in the classroom are going to be bringing something from that background that makes a difference. So maybe can you sort of talk about how you approach this in your classrooms and having conversations around these issues? It sounds like you have a lot of nice long training in this, but yeah, maybe give our lists. So for those of us that are maybe more like me, that for years of their life never brought this up, taught their stats, taught their methods, did not, cognitive psychologists, I think, just got, rated as having less than 1% of all articles even mentioning race.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's not important. So what do you do? How do you do it? What works well? Maybe give our listeners some ideas.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot to say about that.
Right.
So I think more as a broader comment, I think it's important to note, we all have to teach content at some point that we're not comfortable with. That comes up in every teaching context, right? Anyone who's ever taught any kind of survey course has this experience. I remember when I used to teach lifespan developmental psychology, peer relations was something I didn't really know a lot about. And those lectures were a lot worse. And just like, I was less comfortable about it. But I would always acknowledge that it was an area of weakness. I would say, look, I don't have as much background knowledge on this topic. I can tell you some things, I know more than you do because of my position and whatnot, but I don't have a lot of expert knowledge on this topic. And sort of being, to me, that's always good practice, right? Be clear about the limitations of your knowledge. But usually what we do is we still teach those topics, right? Because they're important. So I wouldn't omit peer relations completely from a developmental course, right? It's important for the discipline. It's important for the topic. So I'll still teach it. But with topics of race and culture, I think if instructors feel uncomfortable with it, then they just don't do it, right? They don't include it because it brings them this discomfort. And I think that's really a problem. I think we need to, acknowledge that we're being selective about what we're including or not including and why, and then figure out how to best address it. And there's so many there's a huge literatures to be able to consult about this kind of thing. There's a lot to say. I think in general, what I've found when trying to teach about this topic and race in particular, it just immediately, once you start talking about race, everybody's arousal level goes up, right? Everyone starts worrying about what I might say, what other students might say. There's sort of, especially from white students, sort of feel defensive, right? That comes up right away. And I think in particular, one of the causes of that is that just colloquially or throughout society, we tend to think of racism only as an interpersonal process. So racism is an act that I engage in directed at some other person, right? So I am guilty of some sort of infraction on this other person. And when you think of it solely in that way, it's not surprising that that would lead to defensiveness, right? So it's because you're really looking at, here's something that I'm doing. There's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with the way that I'm acting towards this other person. And I think that's been a major barrier to psychology in general, who tends to think, as you noted, our main focus is on individuals. That's what the discipline is looking at, individual behavior and mental processes. But just because we're focused on individuals doesn't mean we can't also look at the structural level and think about how that might be contouring those individual behaviors. I think this has been one of the appeals, actually, of implicit attitudes and the Implicit Attitudes Association. Implicit attitudes test and why that's been taught so widely. It sort of relieves individuals of being at fault, right? So you can talk about interpersonal attitudes, but it's unconscious. It's not part of your conscious awareness. It's implicit. So then you're not at fault, right? So I think we tend to try to remove that kind of fault as much as possible when teaching about racial issues. Or if we don't do it, then we have potential problems in the classroom with defensiveness. I have found it's been very effective to instead introduce the topic of race and racism from a systemic or structural approach. If you start from that perspective and really get students to understand what that means and how that can relate to specific behaviors that we might see, I think it not only does it help them understand what the broader implications are of racism, but it helps them understand that it's not just about individual guilt and defensiveness and fault and intentions, that it's a much more complex kind of situation. So talking about, criminal justice system, healthcare system, education, housing, toxic exposure, voter suppression, transportation policy, all the things we don't talk about as psychologists, right? That's not stuff that we really, some do, and some do it really well. But as a discipline, that is not at all our emphasis. And most psychologists don't have training in those topics. But you can learn enough where you can talk about this and you can try to think about ways to connect with the students so they can really see it. So one example that has worked really well for me living in the Twin Cities, I live in St. Paul. The highway system, throughout the U.S. really is part of an institutional racism project. And you can see that very clearly in St. Paul, where right in my neighborhood, actually I live 2 blocks away from it, the major freeway, Highway 94 interstate, runs right through what was once the Rondo neighborhood, which was a thriving Black middle-class neighborhood, right? And so I show a picture of here's the neighborhood, here's what it looked like prior to the freeway coming through, and then here's what it looked like when they put the highway in. Right in the middle, it divided the city into two, or the neighborhood, the Black neighborhood, into 2 sections, and how there's some walking paths, some pedestrian bridges that go over, and that those are actually there so that Black parishioners could attend their church that was now on the other side of the freeway. They were actually able to get that sort of concession. And so you only see those footbridges only in the Rondo section of 94. No other part of 94 in the Twin Cities has these footbridges. And you can see that very clearly. You have these students here who are from the Twin Cities or who live around, who have driven on 94 many times. And so it becomes very real to them that they can see this. And then I sort of generalize from there and say, well, you can look at other cities. And so I show San Francisco and I show the highway system there. And just to be able to show this is not just a one-off thing. This was actually institutional policy. that was occurring throughout the U.S. And then, overlaying that on population density maps and things like that really helps them see how there are these broader structural constraints and systems that were at play. And, I really try to spend a lot of time talking about these kinds of issues to make sure they really understand it and understand where it's coming from. And once they get that, then you can talk about, okay, if you can see that racism is a systemic issue, that we live in a racist society, and that, incidentally, that's a comment that I used to make and would be seen as controversial. Now people accept it. I used to get a lot of pushback when I'd say that. My question always is, fine, if you don't think that we live in a racist society, please tell me when in history we stopped being racist. It's very difficult to pinpoint that moment, right? But if you accept structural racism as a reality, then you can get into the psychology or what the implications are that for individual behavior. And essentially, you have three sort of responses to structural racism. You can be actively racist, right? These are people who are really blatantly racist, which we have plenty of folks like that. You can be actively anti-racist, right, where you're working against racism and trying to change the system and improve conditions, or you can be passively racist, and that's the middle ground, right? So if you do nothing, if you take the idea, and I understand that not everyone will agree with it. It's a premise. There's a lot of evidence to suggest it, but if you accept the premise that racism is structural and societal, and that we live in a racist society, if you do nothing, then you will sort of passively internalize some of that and engage in racist interactions. So that's where the interpersonal piece then comes. Some of that can be completely outside of awareness, and some of it is minimally, within our awareness. But you can sort of better differentiate between the active racists, those who are really, part of hate groups and are really explicit about their beliefs, and the passive stuff that happens all the time. And that is particularly useful for contextualizing some of the broader common concepts that we study in psychology, especially in social psychology. So like stereotype threat, for example, which I want to get into that now, although we could, I don't think is a very robust phenomenon. But the concept, the idea of stereotype threat comes out of this idea of passive racism. The implications of microaggressions, right? That comes from the idea of passive racism. A lot of microaggressions don't have intent behind them. Individuals aren't trying to be racist in small ways towards other people, but they're unintentionally doing so because they're part of this broader racist system. And so it allows, so we can get to those individual interpersonal psychological processes, but we're not saying that they start with the individual. They're not just, these are embodied within an individual, but rather they start from the system or the structure. And I mean, this is the way I teach about it. And I personally have found it to be very effective at both the undergraduate level and the graduate level. Sorry, that was a lot.
That's a lot, but I think it gives people, like you said, though, right? Like there are books and articles for days on this. So I think you did a great job of really giving people a very clear starting point and a really nice framework for how you can take this really big, overwhelming thing that, as I think you nodded to, many of us were taught not to talk about at all, and make it so that you can have a coherent narrative that breaks down some of those, especially kind of the initial, right, the defensiveness piece, the silence,
Right.
And the other parts that I imagine, many of our listeners have experienced when they felt like, oh, I'm going to try this. And they're like, wow, that sure flopped.
And that's going to happen. And I'd say just like it happens with all kinds of stuff that we try to teach about, right? Just that this is more ideologically and politically charged. I was about to say in the current environment, but there's nothing current about it. It's been like that forever. But we definitely treat it differently, and we should treat it differently in some ways, right? Because it is sensitive, and people react in different ways than they would if you're talking about perception, right? Take a more individual view or personalized view of it. But all of us who teach have failed miserably at times when we've tried to convey concepts, and then we usually don't just abandon them. Now, sometimes maybe we do, but usually we don't. You figure out, okay, well, how can I do that better? And we listen to student feedback, and we understand if they're getting upset by the way we're teaching, then we're probably not conveying it in the way that we intend. And so we should think about how to approach. And there are a lot of resources that you can use to be able to learn how to teach these things better. That said, no matter what you do, it's always challenging to teach about race. That's just always true. It's always going to be a challenge. You're always going to have pushback from students, both white students who feel like they're being attacked, but also students of color who feel like they're not being appropriately represented, or they don't agree with some of the interpretations or whatever it is. There's just a high potential for problems in the classroom. But again, it's not a reason to not do it. It's really, I think it's a imperative, not just morally, but also in terms of our discipline and the importance of race and racism for psychology.
Yeah, I obviously I'm doing this series because I agree with you, right? I mean, that would be, my implicit goal, if the readers haven't realized yet, is that, I want everyone to be willing to try something. And when that doesn't work, try something else, because we can't pretend like this.
Absolutely.
Sort of the example I was thinking, central limit theorem, right? Like that's really, nobody likes that day in class, but I never ditched it. It's pretty central.
Right? And I think one thing I want to be clear about too is be transparent and aware of my own privilege, that I am a man. I am very tall. I often have a thick beard. I am ethnically ambiguous. I think it's a little bit easier for me to get away with teaching some of these topics. I think some of my colleagues I'm also tenured, right? That helps. Some of my colleagues who are women or other people of color, or who are graduate students who are teaching about these things, can have a really tough time. And, I supervise our Introduction to Cultural Psych course, and usually it's taught by PhD students, and it's an important training opportunity for them. And so I'll meet with them to talk about, before the class starts, I said, you have to be prepared. Like you will have problems. It happens every semester. There will be some students who will come at you, and it could be really aggressive, or it could just be mildly aggressive, but it's going to be aggressive, and this will happen. And so then talking about, being prepared for it, first of all, and then potential strategies for what to do.
No, that's and having that, when the department, going back to the beginning, what we talked about first, if you can have your department kind of all going in the same direction, so your class isn't the only time that it happens.
Right. That helps.
With more practice, with more experience, that also should be helpful. But that is good to also be thinking about for your graduate students, right, that may not have been through this, 75 times already, that they may need some extra encouragement. I mean, that's just always a good reminder that I need. Remember, your grad students are newer at this than you.
Yeah, I mean, they're worried about every possible aspect of teaching when they're starting. They're worried about, do I know the content well enough? Do I know how to communicate it well enough? Do I have enough authority in the classroom? They're worried about all those things, that, not to say that never goes away for people, but it lessens, right, over time. It's not what you're worrying about so much. And then, having that to worry about as well, it can be quite a lot.
Well, great. I just really want to thank you for your time and your ideas and your perspective. And I'm even going to say a bit of hope there about,
That's good.
Realistic hope, right?
Yeah, realistic hope. That's a good way to put it.
But we have, there are things to be done, right? We're not just sitting here trying to invent something to try to work on.
People are doing it. There's people are doing it. There are a lot of resources out there, and they're even though psychologists of color and those who are studying ethnic minorities are still really underrepresented, and there are relatively few. They are out there. We exist, right? And we're doing research, and we're talking about teaching and writing about race, and it's there for those who want it.
Well, I hope that our listeners look some of that stuff up in addition to listening. Thank you again for your time, and have a great day.
Yeah, thanks for having me.